It's a little bit nerve-wracking to be up here because this is the first time I've ever spoken about this subject in any way in a public forum. So we're all going to be learning a bit together. But I suppose this was about 30 years in the making, because when I was 8 years old, I had an experience that forever changed the trajectory of my life. I was in my basement, rummaging around some boxes, because in your house, like the two greatest places to find buried treasure, attics and basements, right? That's where all the bodies are buried. And so I don't even know precisely what I was looking for, but I think most of the guys in the room probably know where this is going to be going. As I got deep enough into one of these boxes, I struck pay dirt. Does anyone want to guess what I found? The Playboy. And it was the first time that I was left alone with this magazine, and it was the first time I'd ever seen boobies. Because that's how like an 8-year-old thinks. That's how an 8-year-old talks. It's actually how a 39-year-old thinks. I just have more evolved language that leaves my mouth most times. But I remember when I opened this thing and like the trifold pops out, and I looked at it, my entire physiology changed in an instant. And I had no idea what was happening to me, but like the blood surging through my veins, like the energy was unlike anything I'd ever experienced before. And then I went on for the next 2.5 decades of my life, completely unchaperoned, completely unguided, with respect to how to process those beginnings. And I did what I think a lot of men do, which is learn about it in isolation on your own, or for some really shitty sources that are out there on the internets. And what this conversation tonight about the discerning dick is really about creating an awakening for most of the men in the room here regarding an understanding of how little active role you've actually played in defining or understanding your sexuality and the foundational roots that formed the beliefs you have today, the behaviors you have today, the desires, your ability to communicate about them or not, your hang-ups, your ability to forge relationships with your partner or not, or to create safe spaces for that person. And I think it's a shitty thing that we have to go about it on our own. And tonight, we're going to be taking like a very small step into some of the forces that created that behavior. And I invite you along on the journey, and it's amazing to see how many of you are here showed up for that. So in a second, I'd love to know a little bit about who is here and like what brought you here. So I'm going to ask for just a few people like why you got here, but a little bit of background of how we ended up here, why this whole conversation came together. So for the past 2 years, I run a monthly men's group. And one of the things we did about a year and a month ago is we went on a men's retreat. Some amazing faces in here. How many guys are in the room here that were on that retreat? Yeah, fellas. Awesome. And over the last year, I've seen these men struggle and elevate and become amazingly better men, all of us. And I saw the power of being able to bring some like really important people who are conscious and supportive of each other, like men coming together in a way that we typically haven't. It's not like over beers. It's not, which by the way, I love eating chicken wings, watching the Super Bowl, drinking beers, and there's more to the story than that. So I was running this monthly, it's not a monthly men's group, probably every other month, and I rented out this room right behind this screen to do this conversation just privately amongst our men's group. And when the Assemblage found out about the topic, they approached me, the programming, and said, this is something that we don't talk enough about. We don't have enough male leaders talking about this stuff. So would you be interested in putting this on the regular programming? I said, hell yeah. This is like the place to have the conversation. And they were like, great, can you open it up to women as well? And I said, all right, game on. Because what we have in this room here, and I just want to bring you present to this, because we have a container here to talk about something that's typically undiscussed, and I think we need to kind of set the stage for who all is in the room. On one end of the spectrum, we probably have some people in here who have never had a conversation openly in any way around sex or sexually related issues in this kind of forum. And then in the other end of the spectrum, we literally have people who have built careers and entire lives around talking about this and consulting about this. And you're going to actually hear from a few of those people tonight. I'm not going to be the only one speaking up here. But I want you to know that you may be sitting next to someone who could be a little bit uncomfortable tonight because this is like the first time that they've been around something like this. And you also may be sitting next to an expert, right? So this is probably a really good opportunity to invite you to let your guard down and to ask questions because you are in the safest kind of environment that most of us can probably conceive of to have these conversations. And also to know that because this is my first time leading a conversation of this type in this room, it may not go perfectly, right? We're running this thing together, and so we're all learning together. I'm going to be sharing some perspectives primarily from the heterosexual male's standpoint because that's my existence. I've coached intimately some gay men, and I know about some of their experiences, but maybe beyond the surface level, but not too deeply. If you are gay, then that is something that we'll be hitting on tonight, but probably mostly is going to be through the lens of a heterosexual male. And the women who are in this room, thank God you're here. We need you. We need your presence. Like, we need your support. We want your inquiry. And also know that we're not perfect too, and we're learning about this, so when we ask questions tonight, it may not come out perfectly either. And the last piece of, I'd say, agreement that maybe I might ask you for is if we are going to be sharing, because I'm going to be asking you to share as much as you feel comfortable, when you share, please do it from a place of your own personal experience versus advice giving. Because you may hear things from other people. We're not giving advice. Give your own story, your own experience, and we can learn through that lens. Does that sound cool? Yeah. Awesome. So I would just love to hear maybe 2 or 3 people, like, could you just tell me, why are you here? What made you show up to an event called the Discerning Dick?
Hi, everyone. My name is Brandon, and I'm here because, I've been hearing about the Assemblage, and then a good friend recommended this event to me. And actually, I've been talking a lot with my good friend. We're doing the Artist's Way together, and topics about masculinity have come up a lot. And he's gay, and I'm straight, but we still the kind of toxic masculinity that has permeated our society, and the kind of the need to feel manly and put up a front and not access our vulnerability and sensitivity has been a huge topic that we've been discussing a lot, and it co-weaves in with sexuality and like my relationship with women. And so when I heard about this, I thought this sounds like perfect, exactly what I would love to hear and talk about right now in my life. So
you're the man. I'm going to ask you to hand it over to Mark in 1 second. Brandon, thank you. One thing that Brendan brought up about masculinity and toxic masculinity, what we're talking about tonight, like through men's sexuality, chunks up to masculinity. Because all roads of a man's identity, I've found, all roads of a man's identity, so his confidence, his self-esteem, his masculinity, all of those roads eventually run through his relationship with his dick. All of them. And to not inspect that, to not explore that, it leads us off into some really weird and wonky directions. So tonight is just about giving you a little bit of a perspective of one of those roads that run us through creating our relationship with our masculinity. Thanks, man.
Hey, everybody, I'm Mark. So part of the reason I'm here is because I'm a good friend of Dom's, and I've known him for a few years now, and I've never seen this man come so alive as when he started to hit on this topic and realize...
Dick stuff.
Dicks. Dom's an incredibly passionate guy about everything he does. I'm sure the men in here that know him can attest to that. But when Dom really started to explore his own journey around this stuff and realized that he could help a lot of people, I saw my friend come alive in a way that I've really just never seen before. And the passion that you bring to this is just unbelievable. And so I'm here in support of you and the fact that you're on such a mission. The other thing to know about Dom is he speaks in a corporate environment very often, and he's so into this that he's actually kind of putting himself on the line to be here and speak to everybody from such an honest, truthful place with us all, because it could be threatening to what he does outside of here. So I'm just in so full support of you, brother. And the other reason that I'm here is because I think it's a really important conversation to have. And I don't think it's too often that people are actually exploring this topic in the way that we're about to. And I'm personally really excited to dive into it and just learn about all the distinctions that you've made on this topic and co-create the conversation with everybody here.
You're the fucking man. Let's hear from one more person.
I think I'm here partly in support of Dom, but I think because my immediate visceral response upon hearing about this event was, well, I can't go to that, right? I couldn't be seen at such a gathering. And I think that generally speaking, when you feel that way, it's a good idea to maybe lean into that and see what's actually there. So I honestly don't know why some part of me is like, no, don't. But I've found it very profitable in my life to sort of steer into those skids. So I'm steering into this one. So.
Awesome. So if you were to actually feel into that right now, why do you think there's a hesitation to be seen at an event like this?
Shame. I mean, I just think that, I don't know that, it's not that I necessarily feel shame right now, but I think that I associate the topic with shame. I associate it with things that need to be kept in the dark. And so, yeah, I think it's probably that simple, that it feels forbidden and it feels like it's associated with shame and
Does anyone
secrecy.
else relate to that? Like, anyone else kind of feel those words? Okay. Thank you, because those are going to be some themes that are coming up over the course of our conversation tonight. And I actually did a little bit of a poll of about 50 men. I'll tell you about that in a second. But those words came up quite often when we talk about sex and sexuality. So thanks. Is there anyone else who has a burning desire to share? Because we'll move it forward. Thank you. And if you just want to hang on to that until someone else talks. All right. So our good friend Robin Williams once said, you see, the problem is God gave men a brain and a penis and only enough blood to run one at a time. And I would say that men have certainly provided enough evidence to validate that quite often. And while that is certainly true in certain parts of my life, and I've seen it in others, I also would like to encourage us to raise our standard. Because the conversation we're having tonight here about the Discerning Dick is that this is a modern man's guide to cultivating the wisdom of the brain between our legs. And I think the prevailing social commentary, like Robin Williams, who I know is supposed to be funny and it's articulate, it's clever, is that we're kind of stupid and that this thing is also stupid and it just drags us around. And while that can be the case if we don't listen to and cultivate and curate a relationship with what's going on inside of our bodies, and absolutely, like we only got one thing going at a time. I know for a fact that men will design their entire lives around the whims of their dick. They'll disrupt their entire lives around the whims of their dick. They may destroy their entire lives around the whims of their dick, right? And it doesn't necessarily have to be that way if we do a little bit of deeper introspection. So the place that I wanted to start, because this is kind of a place that every man finds himself along the journey, is one of the first seminal moments that we have with our dick. And this is when we discover the joys of masturbation. So one of the things that I did was I created, as Mark said, I do corporates. I spent 15 years in corporate America, and like what I do now is I go to corporate events. I came from an annuities conference right before this, okay? And now I get to put dick emojis on my PowerPoint presentations. This is so liberating for me. Okay, so I spent the last 2 weeks asking I had an amazing conversation to 50 men about the first time that they ever masturbated. And I asked them some very specific questions, and I want to share with you the results of that, but let me just show you some of the composition of the people that we talked to. So 50 men, between the ages of 22 and 50 years old. The average age was 37. And the demographic breakdown was not as diverse as I would have liked. You could see mostly white, some Asian, Hispanic, African-American, Indian, Middle Eastern. So as you can see, this is something I need to work on from a diversity perspective. And I would say it's fairly representative of what we have in the room here. I didn't ask the question about whether or not people were heterosexual or homosexual, but from the stories that people told me, it seems like this is primarily a heterosexual survey. This is not statistically significant, And for the purposes of our conversation tonight, I do think it lends enough insight into how some of the men in the room here have formulated their relationships with sex. So, I asked 4 questions. First, how old were you when you learned how to masturbate? How did you learn how to masturbate? This one was fun. What are 3 words to describe that first masturbation to orgasm experience? And number 4, paint the picture of how that first experience went down for me. So I've got stories for you, and I took little screen captures, so we'll be able to go through that in a minute. Okay, here's what came back. 84% of men first started masturbating between the ages of 10 and 14. That probably doesn't surprise a lot of you, but if you've been around a 10-year-old recently, or even a 14-year-old, right? Do you realize how young that is? And for the people I surveyed, we grew up in the Playboy in the box in the basement generation. The kids who are 10-year-olds today, 8 years old today, are the ones who are looking at porn on high-speed internet on mom and dad's phone. Some things have changed at a dramatic clip, but we're going to be talking about our age today. 72% of the people I polled figured this out by accident. Some of the stories were, I thought I broke my dick. Or I thought I peed my pants. Some people had no idea, and I was one of them. I have a story that I'll share with you shortly, but that I had no idea what had happened to me because no one had ever talked about it, right? And 19% found out from someone, like a family or a family member or a friend. Some of these stories are heartwarming. Some of them are heartbreaking. In some cases, we had a family member who took advantage of another person and basically said, oh, it's a lot like wrestling. Let me get on the floor with you and put my hand. And that ended up being a way that this first child learned how to, a sexual touch. Others, it was a friend sleepover with a sleeping bag watching WWE, and Trish Stratus walked on the screen, and the guy's sleeping bag starts moving. He goes, what's that? He's like, this is what I'm doing. He's like, I'll join you. That's how this stuff goes down. It's funny, but it also, this is one of the things that leads to the rest of our lives of kind of figuring out without any real guidance or supervision. And it's so central to who we are as men. So here's the word cloud. I asked the 3 words that you experienced on your first orgasm. Now, this was the first word that came out, and I put them in a word cloud. The larger the word, the more often that word came up. So there's probably not too many surprises up here other than the word surprise, that most of these were really exciting things. Surprise, shock, wonder, discovery, exciting, holy shit. And in some cases, you start to see things like awkward and weird and what happened to me. But what I found to be most insightful was when I started looking through not the second word, but the third word people put, this is where some really interesting themes came up. Can you start to see some of these judgments that popped up? Guilt, shame, and secrecy. Those are the big ones that popped up that really started to illuminate for me that this was not just a me thing. Because, to tell you my story, my very first masturbation story, and this is really going vulnerable. I lived in a very strict household, went to Catholic school. We didn't talk about sex at all in my family. It was hushed tones. So if we were watching a PG-rated movie on a Friday night, which simultaneously was one of the most exciting things in my family's lifetime growing up, but also one of the most frightening things, because anytime there was a sexually suggestive scene, a woman's top coming off, the collective sphincter of the room would tighten. And my parents would lunge across the couch to have me cover my eyes, and they would fast forward and make these disapproving sounds like that. And then for 10 minutes, the tension in the room, you could cut it with a knife and it sent fear through my body. I was not allowed to watch MTV. And my parents had the best, because it was too edgy and racy. My parents had the best of intentions. They thought they were protecting me. And yet at the same time, I always felt that there was something wrong about it, right? But one day, my parents made a mistake. They got sloppy. They left a rated R movie at home, like next to the VCR, while I was home after school and no one was there. And this movie was White Men Can't Jump. Have any of you guys seen White Men Can't Jump? Not Rosie O'Donnell, Jesus. Yes, Rosie Perez. My first masturbation story does not involve Rosie O'Donnell. But it could. She is a beautiful woman. Yeah, I'm not trying to judge. So I sit down and I plop this movie in, and I, unchaperoned, had a chance to watch and rewind the sex scene that Rosie O'Donnell's in. And it's like a pretty harmless sex scene by today's standards. Rosie Perez, now you've gotten me fucked up, man. I'm watching this, and I'm wearing blue sweatpants, and I've got a boner. And I've got the remote control, and I'm rubbing myself with the remote control because it feels good. Rewind, play, rewind, play, rewind, play. And I'm rubbing myself, and then all of a sudden, something shifts in my body where it felt like the thundering force of a New York City fire truck coming through my body that I could not stop, and then, boom, it was just like I blacked out in a supernova of like stars went across my mind, and when I came back to consciousness, I was exhausted, and I had a huge like wet spot in my blue sweatpants, and I panicked. No idea what had just happened, and also, it was the most exhilarating experience in my life. And I don't know about like most of you guys, but like for the men who have figured this out for the first time, like I tried to go right back at it to figure out, could I get that feeling again? It was like no feeling to sensation whatsoever, right? So all I did was I went back, rewound the videotape, went up to the bathtub, I put my like sweatpants behind the bed, and therein was born a habit that I kept for the rest of my life. And as a teenager, because I think I was about 13 years old, for me it was like sitting on an endless supply of heroin. Because I was also at the time of my life where I was a very sensitive kid. I, at the drop of a hat could cry. Like I strike out at the end of a baseball game. I felt like a loser. And I switched schools from Catholic school to public school at that point in time. I felt like I was and not at home. I lost my identity. And so when I discovered masturbation, it was like this immediate cure-all. Anytime I was stressed out, anytime I felt alone, anytime I felt like there was something complex going on, I would turn to that because it brought me to like oblivion. It brought me sedation. Just like for some people it's food, for other people it's whatever, like the bottle as you get older. But for me, that became a conditioning where my first relationship with something sexual was not in connection, was not in like reverence or respect, but it was in like escaping pain. And there was a lot of guilt and shame associated with it, especially because of the fact that in my household it was this certain way. And because I was raised Catholic, pleasure was a sin, and that was something that I was going to hell for, that I truly believed. And when I switched schools to go to this public school, my friends at the time thought masturbation was for perverts and for weirdos. So there was like an ostracizing for anyone that they discovered masturbating. So like those big forces in my life were all telling me this was wrong, this was weird. And so it basically created a lifetime of isolation and shame and guilt that I carried with me for many years until the past 5 to 10 years where I started to really unwind this stuff, and it's still a work in progress. But the survey results are not done, because here's where it gets fun. This is the stories of the men, and I took like their best quotes of that very first time experiencing masturbation. Here we go. As if guided by the hand of God, I went to town. It was like I just discovered a secret doorway in Zelda. I masturbated using anything I could find: sunscreen, shampoo, moisturizer, pillows, soft blankets, and the rest is history. I happened to be laying on a pillow, and then I discovered dry humping. And this last one's my personal favorite. It was there, it was hard, and it wouldn't go away, so I did what any rational human being would do, and I tugged on it a few hundred times. So what I'm trying to do here is to introduce you to the diversity, but also like the universality of these experiences that we all had, to also bring in some of the more serious parts of it, but also to bring in some of the lighter parts of this, because some of this is funny shit, and some of it's also kind of sad. And I want everyone to feel the spectrum of this emotion because it all shows up in our lives today. And I see this with my male friends and the men that I coach and the people that I'm closest to. I see it sometimes show up in lackluster relationships, not having the kind of ability to feel fully accepting of like what they've conditioned in their lives, being able to fully express themselves inside of a relationship, to keep things exciting, to keep things fun, to reveal the deepest, darkest parts of yourself. And at the worst of levels, we see things like Harvey Weinstein, but at the most practical of levels, like for most of us in this room, it's just like this general sense of dis-ease, and maybe that something could be better. And the last place that I want to go here, and I always look for excuse to bring a Metallica quote into this conversation, this felt a lot like how I learned about sex and sexuality. New blood joins this earth, and quickly he's subdued. Through constant pained disgrace, the young boy learns the rules. And what I want to introduce tonight is, how did you learn your rules around what sex was supposed to be? What your dick was supposed to look like? What sexual performance was supposed to be when you watch pornography, but then you also have a reality with the person that you're with? And at a very young age, I felt through three forces that came into my life that it was something where I learned the rules, but through constant pain and disgrace. And this was my life, and it's not necessarily everyone's. So here are the three childhood forces that define your sexuality. And in a moment, I will ask the room to share, like, what may be present to you and which one of these is the most profound for you. I believe that there are three forces that shape your sexuality at a very early age. And this is based on my experience, but through some deep work with men around this topic. And I call these the three Fs. Your family, your faith, or even lack thereof, and your friends. If you think about it, when you were a child, between those ages of like 10 and 14 years of age, how big of a role do these three forces play in your life? It's like all-consuming, right? So for me, I'll speak to my own personal experience, and I would love to hear from some of you in the room here. I already shared with you about my family. Wonderful, amazing parents who showered extraordinary amounts of love on me and still do. And they were deeply uncomfortable talking about any topic related to sex at all. And so in my household, sex was something that was taboo. And when I had these natural desires, I didn't know they were natural. I just thought that they were wrong. And I thought that I was bad. Like I thought I was a bad kid. My faith, I grew up going to Catholic school 7 years, I was a Catholic school kid. I was an altar boy. I went to youth group. I did the whole nine, right? I said my Hail Marys and Our Fathers every single night, 10 of them before I went to bed every night. I believed that I would go to hell if I had premarital sex. I waited until I was 20 to lose my virginity purely for that reason. And it was definitely for that reason. I could definitely have had sex earlier. Just want you all to know that. So my faith was telling me that this was something that was wrong and evil. And I already shared with you that story about my friends, right? It was kind of like, you're the pervert. And I realized that wasn't everyone's experience. As I polled a lot of men, what they shared with me is yeah, my friends thought it was the cool thing to do. Actually, if you weren't masturbating, then you were a loser. And there's certain people who are at home, their families openly discuss this, and there's a reverence around love and intimacy and respect. And they didn't have that kind of guilt and shame that I experienced. So what I would love to know is, for someone in here in this room, is there a force that stood out prominently for you, one of these three Fs, that really helped to shape your sexuality? And would you be willing to share a little bit about that in this forum right now?
So it's really interesting because I'm sure a lot of guys were sort of, including myself, were sort of taught the opposite viewpoint of what these ladies were sharing, where like I grew up with a dad and an older brother who like loved to crack sexual jokes, and like sex scenes were funny, and especially having an older brother who like always had girls over the house and stuff like that. So I grew up with this image that like sex wasn't a big deal, and as the opposite end of that, that was also sort of a problem because like once I got into high school, like I was just chasing to like lose my virginity so fast, you know, and like I didn't even think about like what is sex? What does it matter to the other person? It was more of this sort of just like, oh, this thing that I need to accomplish or this thing that just needs to happen. And like for pretty much all of my teenage years, it was this sort of thing that like gave me status or gave me some sort of like identity. And it took me a while to be like, oh, I feel like crap, but I just had sex with this girl. Why? And it took me a long time to sort of switch my perspective on like what sex is and the importance of sex and like how to approach it in a more mindful sense. So that's
awesome, and thank you for sharing that, because what you're introducing into this conversation is like power plays. So sex in many cases can be power play. It's like I have power if like a woman says yes to me and I sleep with her, then my father thinks I'm cool, my brother thinks I'm cool, and all my friends think I'm cool. Mm-hmm. And so it's actually not at all about the other person that you're with. Maybe for the time that you're with them, it is. But like the predominant behavior, driving force behind your behavior is to seek approval from other people. And then it becomes like, do I even know what the fuck I want?
And that kind of sucks because like you don't really even like enjoy it. And you know, because you're just like so focused on like, what does this mean to me as like being a man or in this culture and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So
I'm gonna make it even more complicated for you. So think about it again. If like your first experience masturbating, like for a guy, like 10 years old, it may be 3, 5, 8 years of working on yourself in isolation without like physically contacting another human being. And you're probably doing it on the daily too. So you're talking about like a long period of conditioning by yourself, selfishly doing whatever it is you want, and then someone else, another human, is introduced into that equation. And now you've all of a sudden got to care about what they want. And it's like that light switch does not very quickly unless you've had unless you're really just good at this stuff or someone has helped guide you in that capacity. So we can, as adults, like grow up, and I know this was something that I've had to work on quite a bit, is sex can be something that's very usury. Like you can extract from someone if a lifetime of conditioning like that is left unchecked, or it could be something where like you can create with the other person. You can connect with the other person. And I'm finding that's actually more difficult than it may sound for most people. But I had conversations with someone who was 28, 29 years old, and he's like, listen, I'm a small guy, and he was underdeveloped when he was younger, and he was like, my first exposure was to porn, and he was like, I'm watching these dudes with dicks out to here, you know, with women, not girls, but like adult women who are having 2 or 3 of these guys at a time with super amounts of aggression, with super amounts of control, with all these different athletic positions. And he was like, this is the standard I'm supposed to be held to? And it's like, there is shame that is like so tied up in this guy that even with a brilliant amount of awareness and work that he's done on himself, it's still something that shows up in his life. And his family dynamic was one where he can't really talk about it either. Hey, you.
Hi. So when I was probably 9 or 10, my friend found a magazine. I think it was Literally in the Gutter. And
wait, was it called Literally in the Gutter, or he found it in the gutter?
No, I believe she found it in the gutter. And it was not a picture magazine. It was written erotica of a really taboo sort. And I took it home, fascinated, and I hid it in my hamper. Because who looks in my hamper?
Mom.
My mom. Yeah. And then of course she found it, right? And I'm like, and then I later hid booze in my hamper. Like, you think I would learn, but so she found it, and she, you know, came into my room to give me a talk, and she sat down with me and she said, Lila, sex is not dirty, but this is dirty. And sex is something really beautiful that happens between people who love each other, and you'll enjoy it someday, but this particular thing is dirty. So she made this distinction for me. And as you were saying, how has that affected me? In all the talking that I've done about this, I haven't thought about that particular thing, how that imprinting has affected me. And the way that it's affected me is that I live in an incredibly sexually permissive community. And
can you describe that for this audience real quickly?
I live in a sex-positive, intentional community where the focus is on sex education, celebration of sex, celebration of any kind of relationship style or structure that suits you, and a celebration of the exploration and an honoring of the fact that it changes throughout our lives and that we can allow it to change. So there's no, you're not married to your relationship style. Things can shift. And that's an ongoing exploration of being human.
That's beautiful. And like the distinction that your mother made for you, right? Around something that here's what's beautiful and here's something that's not. And maybe there's a time and place for you when you're older to process that information.
Yes.
But not right now.
Yes.
And you could see the way that like I know you, I don't know you intimately well, but I know you enough to know that like this is not a source of shame for you. It's something that you talk about and you heal others. And
I feel incredibly fortunate.
Yes.
And I think that is a decisive moment in my upbringing that has allowed me to not feel shame.
Yeah.
And that's something that I didn't have. I contended with lots of other things, lots of other insecurities, but that was not one of them because I had that sit down that was so calm and easeful, and my mom was comfortable speaking about sex and teaching me about it. But I do realize, as you're asking, how did that come through in my life now? Even though I live in this incredibly sexually permissive community, I don't enjoy sex as much when it's not flavored with love. It's not as good for me.
Yeah.
So I remember a friend saying, on a scale of 1 to 10, it's purple. So when there's love, for me, it's purple. And when it's without that, when it's more casual, then it's somewhere in the numbers.
Yeah. And that's a beautiful distinction, Lila. And there's also people who have learned sex and love comes through anger and comes through rage from maybe a parent. Like love from a parent could come in the form of rage and then making up with that child afterwards. And so you can eroticize that rage. And so you're not even knowing it over the course of your life. Like the only way that you can get excited in a sexual relationship is where either maybe you're being demeaned or you have a blowout fight and then after that the makeup sex is like nothing that you've ever seen before. And you don't realize the forces that are at play there, but a lot of that can be entangled in what you learned when you were a child. I would love to leave you with this question of, if you could think about a moment, because every one of us have had like these moments when we were kids that really stand out in terms of a sexual experience. It could be an elative, it could be an embarrassing one, it could be a shameful one, it could be a beautiful one, but it was like a turning point that created a trajectory in your life. I want you to go back to that moment, like when you're on your walk home tonight or in your cab ride home. Think about what that was and what you learned from it and how it's showing up in your life today. And the final piece is, how is it serving you? Like, is it bringing intimacy and love and excitement into your life, or is it bringing some of this other stuff that we talked about? Was everyone commit to at least thinking about that? Awesome. Hey, thanks for listening to the Man Amongst Men podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. And if you want more access to tools and resources, and you want information on our upcoming live events and retreats, head on over to www.doinnerwork.com.